Welcome to Wayne Reese's Least Restrictive Environment Training. In this module, we will review Least Restrictive Environment, or LRE. We will go through the legal cases, research, and best practices to make sure students receiving special education programs and services are placed in their least restrictive environment. It is important to remember that all students are first and foremost general education students. To date, we have found no experimental studies which have demonstrated that students with extensive support needs benefit more from being taught in separate classrooms than inclusive general education classrooms. Please take a moment to pause and reflect on this finding. What is the general education setting? General education settings include core classes and electives, lunchrooms, hallways, playgrounds, gyms, libraries, camps, field trips, and any other location where children without disabilities are educated. This link will take you directly to the Michigan Department of Education Family Matters fact sheet that explains LRE in parent-friendly terms through a practical lens. A student with an IEP does not need to master the general education curriculum for mainstreaming to be a feasible option. Rather, the appropriate yardstick is whether the child with appropriate supplementary aids and services can make progress toward the IEP goals in the general education setting. Does LRE apply to students of all ages? Educational services for students with disabilities should be provided in schools where peers without disabilities attend, in age-appropriate general education programs under the direct supervision of general education teachers, with special education support and assistance as determined appropriate through the student's IEP. Placement decisions, including those related to transition services, must be based on these principles of LRE. The federal law allows states to set an upper age limit for special education eligibility. In Michigan, adult learners with disabilities ages 18 to 26 who qualify have available to them a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. The LRE requirements in Section 612A5 of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, apply to all children with disabilities who are served under Part B of the IDEA, including preschool children with disabilities aged 3 through 5, and in Michigan, starting at age 2 years 6 months. IDEA's LRE provision does not distinguish between school-aged and preschool-aged children. IDEA presumes that the first placement option considered for a preschool child with a disability is the public preschool program the child would attend if the child did not have a disability. In summary, LRE applies to all students aged 2 years 6 months through 26 years old in the state of Michigan. The Federal Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, has guidance on inclusion. So what is inclusion? Inclusion is not referenced in IDEA. It's not a place or a location. There are various perspectives and definitions in research. OSEP believes there are two major components. The first is equity, meaning that all children have access to high-quality, inclusive education. The second is excellence, meaning rigorous, high-quality instruction with high expectations for student outcomes. OSEP's core principles of inclusive practices are as follows. 1. Leadership for school and district and support of teachers. 2. Implementation of equitable practices. All means all. 3. High quality instruction delivered with fidelity. 4. Shared responsibility between general education and special education staff to make individualized, data-based decisions. 5. Participation of all children in grade level activities, building a sense of belonging. and 6, continuous and comprehensive improvement cycles. You see here in this graphic that goal setting and inclusion in general education are both research-based predictors for success in education, employment, and independent living for all students. The following is the law regarding LRE as identified in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. IDEA says that least restrictive environment means that children with disabilities must be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate, and that removals from the regular educational environment occur only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Subset 300.119 addresses the requirement of the SEA, the state educational agency, to provide technical assistance and training opportunities to ensure that administrators and teachers can implement LRE. This graphic depicts the LRE continuum developed by the Michigan Department of Education's Office of Special Education. Take a moment to review and reflect and ask yourself how familiar you were with the other options for placement. Federal law dictates that LRE is to support the following. First, to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Next, to ensure that the rights of children with disabilities and their parents are protected. Also, to assist states, localities, educational service agencies, and federal agencies to provide for the education of all children with disabilities. And finally, to assess and ensure the effectiveness of efforts to educate children with disabilities. There are 3 core tenets of IDEA as it relates to LRE. The 3 overall expectations of the law are as follows: that students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education, that students with disabilities are served in their least restrictive environment, and that services and supports to students with disabilities should be based on student need and in conformity with the IEP or Section 504 plan. Special education is specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of the student and ensure access to the general education curriculum. Public agencies and any other political subdivisions of the state that are responsible for providing education to children with disabilities must ensure that students are placed in their least restrictive environment. LRE is presumed to first be general education. The fundamentals of LRE are as follows. Educational placement is the setting where students with IEPs receive education and services. It's decided by the Individualized Education Program team, and it's documented in the student's IEP. Educational placement must be in the least restrictive environment in the general education setting to the greatest extent appropriate, with students typically developing peers as much as appropriate. When determining the appropriate program for a student, the IEP team must do the following. They must develop an IEP that will allow the student with a disability to make progress that is appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. They must consider any potential harmful effects on the student, like transportation time to and from program location, and/or on the quality of services, like virtual, that he or she needs. The burden of educational support cannot be placed on the parent. IDEA dictates when it is appropriate to place a student in a more restrictive environment. Special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the general education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education and general classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. If the student's placement is in special classes, separate schooling, or other removal from the general education environment, there must be evidence that the IEP team considered a less restrictive setting. That evidence must reveal that based on the nature or severity of the disability, even with the use of supplementary aids and services, progress could not be achieved satisfactorily. Some evidence that can be reviewed includes IEPs, evaluation results, accommodations logs, statements of specially designed instruction, lists of accommodations provided to teacher, classroom observation notes. When determining compliant or non-compliant, description of supplementary aids and services tried for the student needs to be reviewed. For each student who is placed outside of the general education classroom for 20% or more of the day, are the specific supplementary aids and services that were considered identified in the IEP. Also consider if the supplementary aids and services listed were rejected, is a clear reason for the rejection identified in the IEP. If the answer to either question is no, the IEP is non-compliant. As we close out this presentation, we want to remind you that the purpose of our work is to protect students and educate our students in the most appropriate setting possible, maximizing their inclusion with their non-disabled peers. Rules and regulations are in place as compliance protects children. We thank you for your time and support as we embark on this monumental task.